Let's pray. O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable and pleasing in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Today's message is about hope and fear, about salvation and deliverance, about love and care for each other when it seems like the world is falling apart around us. So where do we find hope when fear is real? Where do we look for deliverance when there are unseen forces that afflict and assail us? How can we care for each other? How can we love without measure while staying physically distant for now? Well, let's start with some pictures and a little history lesson. First of all, I wonder if you've ever seen this outfit before. It's usually called a plague doctor, and you can find people dressing like this at Halloween and maybe in horror movies. We look at the bird beak and the thick goggles with the strange hat and the long coat. It's a little intimidating, isn't it? In today's culture, this image of the plague doctor is often scary and frightening, but it wasn't always so. In fact, 700 years ago, the men who wore these clothes were seen as selfless heroes. In the 1300s, there was a terrible disease called the bubonic plague spreading across the continent of Europe. It had a 30 to 90% mortality rate. People called it the Black Death, and it wound up killing almost half of the entire population. When the plague was detected in a town, the sick were taken to hospitals and makeshift wards in churches. And the local governments would seek out help from medical specialists. And here's where the plague doctor came in. The doctor would travel to a town and give care to the sick and afflicted. And when the doctor did this, he would dress as you see here, with this specialized clothing that was designed to keep the physician safe while also allowing care to be given to patients. We have one image of the plague doctor today, that they're scary and frightening, good for scaring ghosts and nightmares. But I want to propose that there is a better way to think about this picture. It is an early attempt to wear protective gear while performing an important medical task, looking after the sick and the dying. If we look carefully at the clothing, we can see on this face mask that the goggles are made of a thick glass that is sewn in carefully to protect the eyes. And what looks to us like a bird beak sticking out the front is actually an early attempt at an air filter. Stuffed with crumpled linen cloth and spices, this was designed to purify the air the doctor was breathing. The hat and thick coat were also meant to protect the plague doctor, who was putting his life on the line to care for the sick. Today we know that the bubonic plague is caused by a bacteria, Yersinia pestis, and it can be treated effectively by several different common antibiotics. Now the plague still pops up here and there, but today there are maybe 3,000 cases worldwide, and 2,500 of those make a full recovery. Unfortunately, back in the 1300s, people didn't know about bacteria and viruses. They did the best they could, but the spices and the cloth put in the plague doctor's mask, well, they were often ineffective. And many of these selfless heroes also themselves caught sick and died. Just as Dr. Li Wenliang in China and other doctors and nurses here in the United States have begun sick with the coronavirus while looking after and treating us. A bit closer in time, there was another pandemic that swept around the globe about 100 years ago now, the Spanish flu of 1918. This flu was a strain of the H1N1 flu virus that we still deal with today, but in 1918 it was brand new. People had little immunity. Around 500 million around the globe were infected over the course of 24 months. Sadly, anywhere from 17 to 50 million people died. And it wasn't just older folks with compromised immune systems. The Spanish flu was especially hard on young people, including soldiers packed together in the trenches of World War I and recruits gathering for basic training in the United States before being sent overseas. In these pictures, we can see some of the ways that people tried to cope with the Spanish flu when they cared for each other. The picture on the left is a nurse at Walter Reed Hospital, the Army Hospital in Washington, D.C. And you can see she's dressed with a mask and a long gown and gloves. On the other side, we have some police officers from Seattle, Washington, wearing these face masks like we see today. They're ready to go out on patrol. And all of this, 100 years later, it looks strangely familiar, doesn't it? I also found this graph from a newspaper at the time. It shows the spread of the Spanish flu in major cities around the world: New York, London, Paris, and Berlin. You can see these dotted lines, and it grows and grows as the months go by. New cases peak, finally, in November, and then they begin to subside. Now, this graph calls to mind a family story that my dad reminded me of when I talked to him this week on the phone. In 1918, right when this graph, the peak of these cases was at its worst, my dad reminded me that my grandfather, his father, was in high school, and my grandfather and my great-grandmother were stricken by the Spanish flu. They suffered through it for weeks, lying in bed at home. Amazingly, both recovered. Now, we aren't sure today how they were exposed or where exactly they stayed in the house while they were sick. My grandfather's father and his sisters also lived there, and they did not get sick. So the family must have used some kind of precautions, done some kind of isolation within their home. Today, we just don't know. Now, my reason for telling these stories and talking about these times is not to add fear and worry to our fear and worry that we already have. In fact, my intent is just the opposite, to remind us that people have faced hard times in the form of viruses and pandemics before, and even though it was difficult, they pulled through. More than that, I want to remind us that there are people in every generation, including ours, who stepped forward to lead with love and compassion and the best knowledge of science and medicine they had. In them, we see humanity at its best. And in their selfless, heroic actions, we see God's Spirit at work. We notice, if we have eyes to see it, that here, in the form of countless acts of compassion and kindness, here the kingdom of God is appearing among us. Today, of course, it's Palm Sunday, the beginning of Holy Week, that helps us remember and retell the story of Jesus' last days, when he entered into Jerusalem to challenge unseen forces of this world, and was betrayed and arrested and put on trial as one disturbing social order. Jesus was sentenced to a shameful death. He was crucified, died, and buried. But then on that first Easter Sunday, God's power was revealed in Jesus' resurrection. God's intentions for the world were made clear, that death and fear and the forces that afflict us, these are not the last word. Instead, we can trust the life and love and the strength of our human family will one day fully triumph and overcome. Now, in the 20-some years that I've been a pastor, there's never been a Palm Sunday quite like this one, where I'm preaching to an empty church, and all of you are tuning in online from the safety of your homes. For this reason, we may be hearing our scripture lesson with different ears today than we do at other times. Even so, it contains a message of hope and of love. When we turn to our reading from Matthew 21, we first hear that Jesus is sending his disciples into town looking for supplies. Now, they are not in search of toilet paper and hand sanitizer. They are not in need of N95 masks or personal protective equipment. Jesus sends them to find a ride, a donkey, so that he can continue and complete his work of proclaiming God's kingdom of love and life and mercy. Jesus does this by entering into the steaming city of Jerusalem, knowing that it will probably cost him his life. But he believes God's promise, "I will never leave you or forsake you." When I read the verses of today's lesson, I notice that the way that Matthew tells this story, it's just a little bit different than the way in which the other gospel writers recount it. While Mark and Luke both tell of one donkey that Jesus rides on, Matthew says that the disciples find two donkeys, a mother and a foal. And he says this to strengthen the verbal connection to the prophet Zechariah that the other gospel writers allude to, but do not quote directly like Matthew does. I know that for some people these little details may not matter so much. But I find it interesting to see how each gospel and each gospel writer tells this story of Jesus. They're mostly the same, but sometimes very different. As a reader, I'm not interested in glossing over these differences or pretending they aren't there. Instead, they make me want to dive in and read the scripture more deeply. So when you and I read these stories in all their beautiful detail, we are able to notice things like these. We wonder why. We ask questions. We develop ideas and theories and possible answers. This is what being a good student of the Bible, this is what good biblical scholarship is all about. And like any good science, good Bible study takes time. It can't be reduced to an internet meme or a Facebook post, but even though it may lead us in unexpected directions, this lifelong habit of good and thorough study, I think, makes us appreciate the Bible and the perspectives of each Bible writer even more. I understand that today, when we read the story of Jesus riding into Jerusalem, we may cringe a little bit when we hear about the crowds of people that are surrounding him. The disciples, they are not sheltering at home. They're there with Jesus, walking down the street with him in a group. And the crowds are all in Jerusalem for the Passover festival. There are thousands and thousands of people packed together in the narrow streets, not maintaining social distancing. And what does Jesus do? He hops on his borrowed donkey and he rides into this maelstrom, this mass of humanity that he has come to serve. Like the doctors and nurses of a later age, Jesus is no stranger to the sick and the suffering. In Matthew's gospel, there are many places where we read about the ways that Jesus heals the sick and helps the poor and feeds those who've been pushed out of their work and livelihoods by circumstances beyond their control. Here at the end of Matthew's gospel, Jesus is almost done doing these things. And this is because he is paying attention to the bigger issues. In our reading, Jesus comes to Jerusalem, which is, in his view, where the root of the problem lies. Knowing that God's people are suffering from sickness, poverty, and food insecurity, Jesus goes into the temple to challenge the social policies that are making things worse. Under the influence of the Roman Empire, the elite power brokers of Israel have increased their acquisition. They've grabbed more and more money, land, and resources, hoarding them for their own benefit, not caring how their greed and desire for self-aggrandizement is harming those whom they claim to serve. So Jesus enters Jerusalem, riding on a donkey as a sign that true leaders are ones who serve God's people. Jesus goes into the temple, casting out, cleansing it of money changers. This is a prophetic sign that God is unhappy with the way that Israel's leaders are acting. He's making a statement that their policies and actions stand in stark contrast to the healing and wellness, the access to food and shelter, to the true community that Jesus has shown are all hallmarks of the kingdom of God. Just as today we are concerned about the interconnected issues of health and economics, In the gospel, Jesus knows that these matters are also both important and that they have a relationship with each other. Throughout Matthew's narrative, we can see that Jesus heals while at the same time teaching that God's kingdom isn't the same as the kingdom of Herod or the empire of Rome. When Jesus comes to Jerusalem, turning over the tables and throwing the money changers out of the temple, he means to demonstrate that the well-being of all people, not just some, this is God's concern. Jesus illustrates this in Matthew 25, which happens a little bit later after the events that we read about today, but before his arrest and crucifixion. The way that Matthew structures this part of the story, chapter 21 is where Holy Week begins, and 26 through 28 is where we'll turn at the end of this week. Now, in between that, there are several chapters where Jesus is teaching in the temple of Jerusalem. And in these chapters, the disciples are asking Jesus. They're a bit worried. They're looking for signs that God is still with them. They're looking for indicators that the kingdom of heaven is among them. They need a reassurance. So here's what Jesus says. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another, just as a shepherd separates sheep from goats. He will put the sheep on his right hand and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom that's been prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we do all these things?" And the king will reply, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." Now I know there's a lot of fear and worry on our minds today. So much so that it changes the atmosphere. It weighs on us. It can feel like it settles into our very bones. But friends, I want to tell you today that there is hope and there will be deliverance because of selfless heroes, because of the power of compassionate love. We know by reading history that the human race has faced hard times before. We've been afflicted by viruses and bacterias, by plagues and influenzas, yet we survived and we carried on. What's more, in each of these circumstances, brave people stepped forward to help. Like Jesus, they laid their lives on the line with compassion. They offered care, tended to the sick, and sought solutions with the best knowledge and technology available at that moment. And the same is true today. I know that this Palm Sunday and this Holy Week are different. These past few weeks and the weeks to come, they are unlike anything we've experienced in our lifetimes. We can't be together, marching with our palm branches and singing happily in church together as a crowd. But despite this, know that we are not alone, and we are not without hope and salvation. When Jesus came into Jerusalem, he showed us what God's presence looks like, a hope and a presence that's with us yet. In generations past, people stepped forward to help others, and in so doing, they demonstrated the love and the compassion of God. So when we are looking for God in these times, when we are wondering if God's kingdom was ever more than just a pleasant fiction, we can find it among us. Wherever doctors and nurses are caring for patients around the world, we can see it whenever neighbors act with kindness through phone calls or dropping off groceries or even staying home to prevent the spread of a disease. We can take part in this kingdom ourselves whenever we act as Jesus did. when we promote healing, food and shelter, and true community that works for every person in this world. We may not be together in person on this Palm Sunday, but friends, we have no less reason to hope, because God's love for us, it hasn't changed, and God's intentions for us and for our world, they endure. Our compassion for each other also does not need to change. In fact, it may be all the more evident in a time like this one. So my prayer for you is this, that you may have hope despite our fears, that you may find deliverance from these forces that afflict us, and that you may experience a love that transforms your life, so that you may also share this same love with the world. Amen.